Lillian Newbury clutched her worn leather satchel tightly against her chest as the stagecoach rumbled into Bismarck, North Dakota, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street. It was 1878, and the promise of a fresh start had lured her west after the devastating news of her parents passing in a fire that had claimed their modest Boston home. The journey had been long, arduous, and far more expensive than she had anticipated, leaving her with precious little of the inheritance her parents had left behind. As the stagecoach came to a halt in front of the Bismarck Hotel, Lillian adjusted her simple blue dress and gathered her courage. At 22 years of age, she had never traveled alone before, let alone to a frontier town where she knew not a soul. The driver opened the door, extending a calloused hand to help her down. "Welcome to Bismarck, miss," he said, tipping his hat. "Mind your step now." Lillian thanked him, her eyes darting around the bustling street. Men in dusty work clothes mingled with occasional women in practical dresses, while horses and wagons traversed the unpaved road. The smell of dust, horse manure, and cooking food hung in the air. "My bags?" she asked timidly. "Right here, miss," the driver said, hauling down her single trunk from the top of the coach. "Where might you be heading? New in town, I reckon?" "Yes," she said, pulling a piece of paper from her pocket. "I'm to meet with a Mr. Wilkinson about a position at the schoolhouse." The driver nodded, pointing down the street. "Town hall's just yonder, third building past the Mercantile. Wilkinson's likely there this time of day." With a grateful nod, Lillian approached a young boy leaning against a hitching post. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Would you be willing to help me with my trunk? I can pay a small fee." The boy, no older than 12, straightened immediately. "Yes'm, 10 cents and I'll take it anywhere in town." After arranging for her trunk to be delivered to the boarding house she'd been told about in her correspondence with Mr. Wilkinson, Lillian made her way toward the town hall. Her steps slowed as she passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, where raucous laughter spilled out onto the street. A man stumbled through the swinging doors, nearly colliding with her. "Pardon me, madam," he slurred, his breath reeking of whiskey. Lillian sidestepped him quickly, clutching her satchel tighter. Boston had its rough areas, but there was something rower about this frontier town that both frightened and exhilarated her. She couldn't help but wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake coming here. The town hall was a relatively impressive structure for a frontier settlement, boasting actual glass windows and a fresh coat of white paint. Inside, she found a surprisingly orderly office where a bespectacled man sat behind a desk, reviewing papers. "Mr. Wilkinson?" she inquired. The man looked up, adjusting his spectacles. "Yes, how may I help you? I'm Lillian Newbury. We've corresponded about the teaching position." Recognition dawned on his face as he stood, extending his hand. "Miss Newbury, we weren't expecting you until tomorrow. Welcome to Bismarck." "The journey was quicker than anticipated," she explained, shaking his hand. "I hope my early arrival isn't an inconvenience." "Not at all, not at all," he assured her, gesturing for her to take a seat. "We're delighted to have you." "Our last teacher, Miss Henderson, left us rather abruptly to marry a cattle baron from Montana," he chuckled. "That seems to be the fate of many of our school teachers, I'm afraid." Lillian smiled politely. "I assure you, Mr. Wilkinson, I've come west to teach, not to find a husband." Of course," he said, though his expression suggested he'd heard such declarations before. "Now, as I mentioned in my letter, the position comes with room and board at Mrs. Farley's boarding house. The schoolhouse is just a short walk from there. The term begins in 2 weeks, which should give you ample time to settle in and prepare your lessons." They discussed the particulars of her employment, her salary, the number of students, 28 children of varying ages, and her responsibilities. By the time they concluded their meeting, the sun was beginning to set. "I believe your trunk should have arrived at Mrs. Farley's by now," Mr. Wilkinson said, escorting her to the door. "It's just 3 blocks east, the white house with the blue trim and the picket fence. You can't miss it." Lillian thanked him and stepped back onto the street, which was now bathed in golden evening light. She felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The teaching position seemed promising, but the reality of being alone in this frontier town was beginning to sink in. As she walked toward Mrs. Farley's boarding house, the sound of piano music and boisterous voices from the Silver Dollar Saloon grew louder. Just as she was about to pass it, the doors burst open and 2 men emerged, arguing loudly. "I'm telling you, Sullivan, she's perfect," one man said, his voice carrying in the evening air. "Harper's looking for a new girl. The last one ran off with that gambler from St. Louis." "Doesn't look the type," the other man, presumably Sullivan, replied skeptically. Lillian quickened her pace, keeping her eyes fixed straight ahead. She'd heard stories about the dangers that could befall a woman alone in these frontier towns. "Hey, you there, miss," the first man called out. Lillian hesitated, then stopped, turning reluctantly to face them. Both men were well-dressed compared to the other townspeople she'd seen, sporting fine suits and silk waistcoats that seemed out of place in the dusty street. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said cautiously, her Boston upbringing compelling her to be polite despite her unease. The first man approached, removing his hat to reveal slicked-back dark hair. He offered what he clearly thought was a charming smile. "Good evening, miss. Name's Jasper Reid, and this is my associate, Thomas Sullivan. Couldn't help but notice you're new in town." "I am," Lillian acknowledged, taking a small step back. "If you'll excuse me, I'm expected at my lodgings." "Now, hold on just a minute," Reid said, stepping closer. "We might have an opportunity for a fine-looking woman like yourself, better than whatever brought you to this backwater." Sullivan nodded eagerly. "Harper's musical review is coming through town next week. They're looking for talented ladies to join their show. Pays well, too." "I appreciate the information, but I'm the new school teacher," Lillian replied firmly. "Good evening, gentlemen." She turned to leave, but Reid's hand shot out, gripping her arm. "School teacher, that's no life for a pretty thing like you. Come on, at least meet Harper. He's inside." "Please release me," Lillian said, her heart pounding as she tried to pull away. "Just come have a look," Sullivan insisted, moving to her other side. "No harm in that." "I said no, thank you," Lillian repeated, her voice rising slightly as panic began to set in. Both men were now flanking her, Reid still gripping her arm. "It'll just take a minute," Reid said, his friendly demeanor giving way to something more insistent as he began pulling her toward the saloon. "Harper's putting together quite a show, singing, dancing. Nothing improper, of course. Unhand me this instant," Lillian demanded, struggling against his grip, her satchel clutched protectively to her chest. But Reid and Sullivan were now practically dragging her toward the saloon doors. She said no. The deep, quiet voice cut through the commotion like a knife. Lillian and her unwanted companions turned to see a tall man dismounting from a chestnut stallion. He tied the horse to the hitching post with deliberate movements before turning to face them fully. He wore the practical clothing of a working man, a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, sturdy denim pants, and boots that had seen many miles. A revolver hung at his hip, though his hand made no move toward it. His face was partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but Lillian could make out a strong jaw darkened by stubble. Reid scoffed. "This doesn't concern you, York. We're just offering the lady an opportunity." "Doesn't look like she wants your opportunity," the man York replied, his voice remaining calm but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. "We work for Harper," Sullivan said defensively. "He's looking for new talent for his show." York stepped closer, his movements measured but purposeful. "And I reckon the lady's already given you her answer." Reed's grip on Lillian's arm tightened. "Harper won't be happy if we come back empty-handed. He needs to replace—" "She's not going," York interrupted, reaching out to firmly but carefully extract Lillian from Reed's grasp. He positioned himself slightly in front of her, creating a barrier between her and the two men. "Miss is free to make her own choices, and she's chosen not to go with you." There was a tense moment as Reed and Sullivan seemed to weigh their options. Lillian held her breath, acutely aware of how quickly frontier disagreements could escalate to violence. But something in York's steady gaze must have convinced them to back down. "Harper ain't gonna like this," Reed muttered, straightening his suit jacket with an indignant tug. "Harper can find willing participants," York replied evenly. "Good evening, gentlemen." With final glares, Reed and Sullivan retreated back into the saloon, the doors swinging shut behind them. Lillian released a shaky breath. "Thank you, Mr. York. I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't intervened." He turned to face her fully, and she got her first clear look at him. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with striking blue eyes that contrasted with his sun-darkened skin. A small scar ran along his right cheekbone, and there was a weariness in his expression that spoke of hard-earned experience. "Yates," he corrected gently. "Yates Xavier, and you're welcome, Miss Newbury, Lillian Newbury. I've just arrived in town to take up the position of schoolteacher." Something like approval flickered across his face. "Bismarck needs a good teacher. The children here deserve an education." He glanced toward the saloon. "Those two work for Bartholomew Harper. He runs a traveling show, part theater, part music hall. Some of it's respectable enough, but he's got a reputation for pressuring young women into performances that, well, let's just say they aren't suitable for your students to attend." Lillian shuddered. "I see. I appreciate your intervention all the more then. Where were you headed?" he asked, retrieving his horse's reins from the hitching post. "Mrs. Farley's boarding house. Mr. Wilkinson said it's not far." "It's not, but I'd feel better walking you there if you don't mind the company. Reed and Sullivan might try their luck again if they see you alone." Under normal circumstances, Lillian might have hesitated to accept an escort from a stranger, but these were hardly normal circumstances. Besides, there was something reassuringly straightforward about Yates Xavier. "I would appreciate that, Mr. Xavier. Thank you." He nodded, leading his horse alongside them as they began walking east. "What brings you all the way to Bismarck, Miss Newbury? Your accent suggests you're from back east." "Boston," she confirmed. "I needed a change of scenery after my parents passed." She didn't elaborate further, and he didn't press. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said simply. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Lillian's curiosity got the better of her. "And you, Mr. Xavier, are you from Bismarck originally?" A small smile crossed his face. "No, madam. Originally from Texas. Been drifting north for a few years now. I work for the Carter Ranch just outside town, foreman there." "I see. I confess I know very little about ranching." "It's honest work," he said. "Hard but honest." They turned a corner, and Lillian spotted a white house with blue trim and a neat picket fence exactly as Mr. Wilkinson had described. Light glowed warmly from the windows, and a sign reading "Farley's Boarding House" hung by the gate. "This is it," she said, stopping at the gate. "Thank you again for your assistance, Mr. Xavier." He touched the brim of his hat. "My pleasure, Miss Newbury. Welcome to Bismarck." He hesitated, then added, "Word of advice. Bismarck's growing fast, but it's still a frontier town." Best to have a companion when walking about, especially near the saloons. Lillian nodded, absorbing his advice. I'll remember that. Good night, Mr. Xavier. Good night, Miss Newbury. He mounted his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. I suspect we'll be seeing each other around town. With that, he urged his horse forward, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Lillian watched him go, a curious feeling settling in her chest. Then, squaring her shoulders, she opened the gate and approached the boarding house door, ready to begin her new life in Bismarck. Mrs. Farley proved to be a bustling, middle-aged widow with a no-nonsense attitude, and a warmth that immediately put Lillian at ease. She showed Lillian to a small but clean room on the second floor, where her trunk had already been delivered. "Supper's at 6 sharp," Mrs. Farley informed her. "We've got 3 other boarders, Mr. Peterson, who works at the bank, Miss Thornton, who assists at the dressmakers, and Dr. Mills, though he's often called away for emergencies. Quiet hours after 9, breakfast at 7. Any questions, dear?" "No, Mrs. Farley, this all seems perfect." "Good, good. Get settled in, and I'll see you downstairs for supper. Oh, and mind you lock your door at night." Bismarck's growing more civilized by the day, but it doesn't hurt to be careful. After Mrs. Farley left, Lillian sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the day's journey and events. She was hundreds of miles from everything she'd ever known, in a town where she'd already had one uncomfortable encounter, saved only by the timely intervention of a mysterious rancher. "What have I gotten myself into?" she whispered to the empty room. But as she unpacked her meager belongings and washed up for supper, Lillian found herself thinking of Yates Xavier's steady blue eyes and calm confidence. There was something undeniably reassuring about knowing there were good people in Bismarck, even if her first impression of the town had been somewhat alarming. By the time she joined the other boarders for supper, Lillian had resolved to approach her new life with determination and optimism. After all, she reminded herself, she hadn't come west seeking safety and comfort, she'd come seeking a purpose and a fresh start. And tomorrow would be her first full day of discovering what Bismarck had to offer. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with the early September sun casting a golden glow over Bismarck. Lillian rose early, eager to explore the town that would be her home for the foreseeable future. After a hearty breakfast with her fellow boarders, during which the kindly Dr. Mills offered to show her around town after his morning appointments, she set out to visit the schoolhouse. Mr. Wilkinson had provided her with a key, and she found the building easily enough, a modest structure at the edge of town with a bell tower and a small yard. Inside, the single room was equipped with rows of benches and desks, a larger desk and blackboard at the front, and shelves of well-worn books along one wall. A pot-bellied stove stood in the corner for the coming winter months. Lillian ran her hand along the teacher's desk, imagining herself standing before a classroom of eager young minds. Despite the simplicity of the room, it felt right somehow. This was where she could make a difference, where she could build something meaningful. She spent the morning taking inventory of the books and supplies, making notes of what she'd need to request from Mr. Wilkinson, and beginning to outline lessons for students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. It would be challenging, certainly, but the challenge invigorated her. Around midday, a knock at the schoolhouse door interrupted her work. She opened it to find Dr. Mills, a genial man in his 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Thought I might find you here," he said cheerfully. "Ready for that tour of Bismarck I promised?" Lillian gratefully accepted, locking up the schoolhouse behind her. Dr. Mills proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out the town's essential businesses: the general store, the post office, the bank, the dressmaker's shop where Miss Thornton worked, his own medical practice, and places she should avoid, particularly after dark. "The silver dollar's not the worst of them," he explained as they passed the saloon where she'd had her unfortunate encounter the previous day. "But even so, a respectable lady such as yourself would do well to give these establishments a wide berth." "I had a rather unpleasant experience there yesterday," Lillian admitted. "Two men tried to force me to meet with someone named Harper about joining his show." Dr. Mills frowned deeply. "Bartholomew Harper." "Yes, he brings his traveling show through every few months. Parts of it are wholesome enough entertainment, but there are rumors about how he treats the young women who work for him." He looked at her with concern. "I hope you weren't harmed." "No," a Mr. Xavier intervened. "Yates Xavier from the Carter Ranch." Recognition lit the doctor's face. "Ah, young Xavier. Good man. Doesn't say much, but he's well respected. Came to town about 2 years ago and quickly proved his worth at the Carter place. He's foreman there now, runs most of their operations while old man Carter focuses on expanding his holdings." He chuckled. "Half the unmarried ladies in town have set their caps for him, but he keeps to himself mostly." Lillian felt a flush creeping up her neck and quickly changed the subject. "What can you tell me about the families whose children I'll be teaching?" The tour continued with Dr. Mills providing insights about the town's residents and history. By late afternoon, Lillian felt she had a much better understanding of her new home. "Thank you for taking the time to show me around," she said as they approached the boarding house once more. "It's been most informative." "My pleasure, Miss Newbury. Bismarck needs a good teacher, and I'm glad you've joined our community." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving Lillian to reflect on all she'd learned. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Lillian met many of the parents and children who would be in her classroom, ordered necessary supplies, and developed a comprehensive teaching plan. Mr. Wilkinson proved supportive, approving most of her requests and introducing her to key members of the community. She didn't see Yates Xavier during this time, though she found herself looking for him whenever she ventured into town. Dr. Mills had mentioned that the ranch kept him busy, especially as they prepared for the coming winter months, but she couldn't help feeling a twinge of disappointment. The day before school was to begin, Lillian was at the general store, purchasing last-minute supplies when the bell above the door jingled. She glanced up to see Yates entering, removing his hat as he stepped inside. He was dressed much as she remembered, though his clothes seemed fresher, his face newly shaved. He spotted her almost immediately, and a flicker of recognition crossed his features before he offered a polite nod. "Miss Newbury." "Mr. Xavier," she replied, surprised at the small thrill she felt at seeing him again. "How nice to see you. Likewise. You've been settling in well." "Yes, thank you. Everyone has been most welcoming." She gestured to her basket of supplies. "I'm just gathering the last few items I need for school tomorrow." "First day already." He moved closer, examining the items in her basket: chalk, paper, pencils, and a small bell. "The children are looking forward to it. The miller's boy Tommy hasn't stopped talking about the new teacher from Boston." Lillian smiled, pleasantly surprised that he remembered where she was from. "I hope I won't disappoint him." "I doubt you will," Yates said with quiet confidence. He hesitated, then added, "I was sorry not to have run into you sooner. Ranch work keeps me busy." "So I've heard. Dr. Mills mentioned you're the foreman at Carter Ranch." Yates nodded, a hint of pride in his expression. "It's good work, keeps me outdoors, which suits me." An awkward silence fell between them, broken when the shopkeeper, Mr. Bennett, called out from behind the counter, "Your order's ready, Mr. Xavier." "Thank you," Yates replied, then turned back to Lillian. I should let you finish your shopping, of course. She hesitated, then added impulsively, perhaps I'll see you around town sometime. A small smile touched his lips. I'd like that, Miss Newbury. He touched the brim of his hat, then moved to the counter to collect his order. Lillian finished her own shopping, acutely aware of his presence nearby. As she paid for her items, she overheard Mr. Bennet saying something about Harper's show that caught her attention. They've set up at the edge of town, the shopkeeper was saying. Posters say they'll be here for a week. Big tent show with music and whatnot. Yates's expression darkened slightly. Harper's still with them, far as I know. Why? No reason. Yates glanced toward Lillian and she quickly averted her eyes, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping. Just heard things is all. She gathered her purchases and headed for the door, but Yates caught up with her before she stepped outside. Miss Newbury, he said quietly, I should warn you. Harper's show is in town, which means Reid and Sullivan will be around. They might still be sore about our last encounter. Concern flickered in his eyes, and Lillian felt a warmth in her chest at his thoughtfulness. Thank you for the warning, Mr. Xavier. I'll be careful. He nodded, seemingly relieved. Would you allow me to walk you back to your boarding house? I'm headed that direction anyway. Lillian accepted gratefully, and they stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight together. As they walked, their conversation flowed more easily than she might have expected, touching on her preparations for the school year, his work at the ranch, and their respective journeys to Bismarck. What brought you north from Texas? She asked as they turned onto the street where Mrs. Farley's boarding house stood. Something flickered across his face, a shadow of old pain quickly masked. Needed a change, he said simply. Texas had too many memories after the war. You fought in the war between the states? She asked, surprised. He seemed too young to have served. Joined up near the end when I was just 16, he admitted. Too young to know better, old enough to carry a rifle. He shook his head. Saw enough in those few months to last a lifetime. Lillian's heart ached for the boy he must have been. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, he said, his tone suggesting he didn't wish to discuss it further. Then, perhaps to change the subject, he asked, what about you? What really brought you all the way from Boston to Bismarck? Lillian hesitated. She'd told others only the simplest version of her story, parents deceased, seeking a fresh start. But something about Yates's direct gaze made her want to offer more of the truth. My parents died in a fire last winter, she began slowly. Our home was destroyed and I found myself alone with few prospects. I had trained as a teacher but had yet to secure a position. When I saw the advertisement for Bismarck, it seemed providential, a chance to start anew where no one knew me or pitied me. Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes the best thing a person can do is ride toward a new horizon. Exactly, Lillian said, relieved that he understood without requiring further explanation. They reached Mrs. Farley's gate, and Lillian turned to face him. Thank you for escorting me, Mr. Xavier. My pleasure, Miss Newbury. He hesitated, then said, I wonder if you might consider. That is, would you permit me to call on you properly sometime? Perhaps this Sunday after church. The invitation caught Lillian by surprise, though not an unpleasant one. Her pulse quickened as she considered his request. She barely knew this man, and yet there was something about him, a steadiness, a quiet strength that drew her. I would like that very much, Mr. Xavier, she replied, a smile brightening her features. His own smile in return transformed his face, erasing the habitual seriousness and revealing a handsome, even boyish quality she hadn't fully appreciated before. Until Sunday, then. As she watched him walk away, leading his horse down the street, Lillian felt a flutter of anticipation. Tomorrow she would begin her new role as Bismarck's schoolteacher, and Sunday. Sunday held the promise of something she hadn't expected to find in this frontier town: connection. The first day of school dawned clear and cool, with just a hint of autumn crispness in the air. Lillian arrived early, wanting everything to be perfect for her students' arrival. She arranged the desks, wrote the day's lessons on the blackboard, and placed a shiny red apple on her desk, a small touch of home that made her smile. By 8 o'clock, children began arriving, some accompanied by parents eager to meet the new teacher, others in groups of siblings. By 8:30, 26 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age filled the benches, their faces a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and in a few cases mischief. "Good morning," Lillian said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "I am Miss Newbury, and I'm honored to be your teacher. Before we begin our lessons, I'd like to learn all of your names." The morning progressed better than she could have hoped. The children were generally attentive, and though there were a few challenging moments, particularly with a 13-year-old boy named James, who clearly felt he was too old for schooling by lunchtime, Lillian felt she had established a good rapport with most of her students. As the children filed out for their midday break, a small girl with pigtails and a missing front tooth lingered behind. "Miss Newbury," she said shyly. "Yes, dear. You're Emma, correct?" The girl nodded, pleased to be remembered. "Yes, madam. I just wanted to say you're the prettiest teacher we've ever had, and you talk so nice. Are all ladies from Boston as pretty as you?" Lillian laughed softly, touched by the child's artless compliment. "That's very kind of you to say, Emma. And I think there are pretty ladies everywhere, including right here in Bismarck. My pa says Mr. Xavier at the Carter Ranch thinks you're pretty too," Emma continued innocently. "Pa works for Mr. Xavier, and he heard him telling Mr. Carter he met the new school teacher, and she was the most elegant lady he'd ever seen." Heat rose to Lillian's cheeks. "Is that so?" she managed, not knowing quite how to respond to this second-hand compliment. Emma nodded vigorously. "Pa says Mr. Xavier never talks about ladies, so you must be special." "Well," Lillian said, feeling flustered, "you'd better run along and have your lunch now, Emma. We have much more to learn this afternoon." As the girl skipped away, Lillian pressed her cool hands to her warm cheeks, trying to compose herself. The idea that Yates had spoken of her, had found her elegant, caused a flutter in her stomach that was both disconcerting and delightful. The rest of the school day passed in a productive blur, and by the time she dismissed the children at 3 o'clock, Lillian felt a deep satisfaction with her new role. She stayed behind to tidy up and prepare for the next day, finally locking the schoolhouse door as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. As she walked back toward town, Lillian found herself reflecting on her first impressions of Bismarck. It was rougher than Boston, certainly, with its unpaved streets and frontier attitudes, but there was an energy here, a sense of possibility that she found invigorating. And the people, for the most part, had been welcoming and kind. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices coming from an alleyway between the general store and the barber shop. Instinctively, she slowed her pace, hesitant to pass by whatever confrontation might be occurring. "I told you, I ain't interested." A young woman's voice, distressed and angry. "Harper doesn't take no for an answer, sweetheart." A man's voice, familiar and unwelcome. Raid. Lillian's heart sank. She should walk on, find the sheriff or another man who could intervene, but the young woman's voice sounded so frightened. Gathering her courage, Lillian peered around the corner of the building. Reed and Sullivan had cornered a young woman against the back wall of the general store. She was perhaps 18 or 19, plainly dressed in a worn calico dress, her blonde hair tumbling from what had once been a neat bun. "Please, just let me go," the girl was saying, her voice trembling. I need to get home. My pa will be looking for me." "Your pa won't mind once he sees how much money you'll be making," Sullivan replied, blocking her attempt to sidestep around them. "Harper pays his girls well." "I don't want to be one of Harper's girls," the young woman retorted, a flash of spirit breaking through her fear. "I've heard about his shows. They're not respectable." Reed reached out, grabbing her arm. "Come on, just meet him. He's expecting you." Without fully considering the consequences, Lillian stepped into the alleyway. "Excuse me," she called out firmly, channeling the authoritative tone she used in her classroom. "Is there a problem here?" All three heads turned toward her. Reed's expression darkened with recognition, while Sullivan looked merely annoyed at the interruption. The young woman's eyes widened with a mixture of surprise and desperate hope. "This doesn't concern you, schoolteacher," Reed said dismissively. "Move along." "I believe it does concern me when I see two grown men harassing a young woman," Lillian replied, moving closer despite the hammering of her heart. "Let her go immediately." "Or what?" Sullivan challenged, taking a step toward Lillian. "You'll give us extra homework." Reed laughed, but his grip on the young woman's arm didn't loosen. "You should have learned your lesson the first time, Miss Newbury. This is Harper's business, and Harper gets what he wants in Bismarck." "Not this time," Lillian said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I suggest you release her before I call for the sheriff." "Sheriff's out of town until tomorrow," Reed informed her with a smirk. "And your cowboy friend isn't around to help you this time." Fear flickered through Lillian, but she stood her ground. "I won't ask again. Let her go." Sullivan stepped closer, forcing Lillian to back up against the wall of the barber shop. "Maybe Harper would be interested in both of you. A school teacher would be a novelty in his show." Lillian's mouth went dry, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "Touch me, and I promise you'll regret it." "Big words from a little lady," Reed mocked, dragging the blonde girl forward. "Sullivan, bring the teacher. Harper's waiting." Sullivan reached for Lillian's arm, but before his fingers could close around it, a large hand clamped down on his shoulder, spinning him around. "I believe the lady asked you to stop," Yates Xavier said, his voice dangerously quiet. Relief flooded through Lillian at the sight of him. His expression was controlled, but she could see the anger simmering in his blue eyes. "Xavier," Red spat, "this is getting to be a habit with you." "One you'd be wise to break," Yates replied evenly. "Let the girl go, Reed." Reed's grip tightened on the blonde's arm, making her whimper. "Harper wants to see her. She's perfect for the show. Doesn't look like she agrees." Yates took a step forward, his presence suddenly seeming to fill the narrow alleyway. "Last chance, Reed. Let her go, and you and Sullivan walk away." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Sullivan, apparently deciding discretion was the better part of valor, took a step back. "Come on, Jasper. There are other girls. It ain't worth tangling with Xavier." Reed hesitated, his expression darkening with frustration, before finally releasing the girl's arm with a shove that sent her stumbling forward. Yates caught her easily, steadying her before positioning himself between the two women and Harper's men. "This isn't over," Reed warned, straightening his jacket with an indignant tug. "Harper won't be happy." "Harper's happiness isn't my concern," Yates replied coldly. "Now get going, both of you." With final glares, Reed and Sullivan retreated from the alleyway, disappearing around the corner of the general store. Once they were gone, Yates turned to the young women, his expression softening with concern. "Are you both all right?" The blonde girl nodded shakily, rubbing her arm where Reed had gripped it. "Yes, sir, thank you." "I'm fine as well," Lillian assured him, though her heart was still racing. "How did you know we were in trouble?" "I didn't," Yates admitted. "I was at the livery stable across the street and saw you enter the alleyway. Something didn't seem right, so I followed." He turned to the blonde girl. "What's your name, miss?" "Lucy Miller, sir. I work at the dressmaker's shop." Tommy Miller's sister?" Lillian asked, recognizing the surname of one of her students. Lucy nodded. "Yes, madam, you must be the new teacher. Tommy came home full of stories about you today." "I'll see you both safely to wherever you're headed," Yates offered. "Reed and Sullivan might still be lingering nearby." Lucy's expression darkened. "They've been following me for 3 days now. Ever since Harper's show came to town. They won't take no for an answer." "They will now," Yates assured her grimly. "And I'll have a word with Sheriff Davies when he returns tomorrow." As they walked Lucy to her family's small house on the outskirts of town, Yates explained to Lillian that he'd been in Bismarck to purchase supplies for the ranch when he spotted her. "It seems I'm making a habit of rescuing you from Harper's men," he observed, though there was no mockery in his tone. "I was attempting to do the rescuing this time," Lillian pointed out. "Though I admit I hadn't thought through what would happen if they called my bluff about the sheriff." A small smile touched Yates's lips. It was brave, nonetheless. After seeing Lucy safely home, Yates accompanied Lillian back toward Mrs. Farley's boarding house. The sun was setting now, painting the western sky in dramatic hues of orange and pink. "May I ask you something, Mr. Xavier?" Lillian ventured as they walked. "Yates, please," he replied, "and yes, you may ask me anything." "Yates," she repeated, testing the familiarity of his given name. "Why does Harper seem to have such influence in Bismarck, and why are his men so persistent?" Yates's expression grew serious. "Harper's been coming through these parts for years. His show brings entertainment and outside news, which folks here value. He's cultivated relationships with certain businessmen in town, including the owner of the Silver Dollar, who profits when Harper's show brings in crowds." He paused, seeming to consider how much to say. "As for the persistence, Harper's shows include performances by young women, dancing, singing, that sort of thing. But rumors suggest some of his performers are expected to entertain certain customers privately after the shows. Girls who try to refuse often find themselves in difficult situations." "That's horrible," Lillian said, appalled. "Why doesn't the sheriff do something? Hard to prove, and the girls rarely stay in one place long enough to file complaints." "Harper moves his show from town to town, always ahead of any real trouble." Yates shook his head. "Sheriff Davies is a good man, but even he has limited authority when it comes to Harper's business practices." They reached Mrs. Farley's gate, and Lillian turned to face him. "Thank you again for your assistance today. I'm just glad I was nearby," he said sincerely, "though I have a feeling you would have handled things even without my intervention." Lillian smiled, appreciating his confidence in her. "Perhaps, though I must admit I was relieved to see you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the lengthening shadows of evening wrapping around them. "I should let you get inside," Yates said finally, "but I'm still hoping you'll allow me to call on you this Sunday." "Yes," Lillian replied without hesitation. "I'd like that very much." His smile warmed his features in a way that made her breath catch. "Until Sunday, then. Good night, Lillian." "Good night, Yates." As she watched him walk away, Lillian felt a curious mixture of emotions: lingering fear from the confrontation with Reed and Sullivan, gratitude for Yates's timely intervention, and an undeniable flutter of anticipation at the thought of seeing him again on Sunday. It was too soon to put a name to the feeling blooming in her chest, but she couldn't deny that Yates Xavier was becoming increasingly important to her in ways she hadn't expected. The remainder of the week passed in a pleasant rhythm as Lillian settled into her role as Bismarck's schoolteacher. Her students proved eager to learn, for the most part, and she found herself genuinely enjoying their company and the challenges of teaching multiple grade levels simultaneously. Evenings were spent preparing lessons, grading assignments, and occasionally joining her fellow boarders for games of whist or discussions about books. On Saturday, Lillian accompanied Miss Thornton from the boarding house to the dressmaker's shop where the young woman worked. She hadn't planned to purchase anything, given her limited budget, but when she mentioned her upcoming Sunday meeting with Yates, Miss Thornton insisted she at least try on a lovely blue dress that would bring out your eyes perfectly, Miss Newbury. To Lillian's surprise, Lucy Miller was indeed working at the shop. Though the girl seemed subdued, her usual cheerfulness dampened by her encounter with Reid and Sullivan. When Lillian inquired after her well-being, Lucy assured her that she was fine, though she admitted to taking a different route to and from work to avoid Harper's men. Sheriff Davies spoke with them yesterday when he returned to town, Lucy explained as she pinned the hem of the blue dress Lillian had been persuaded to purchase. They denied everything, of course, but at least they've stopped following me openly. I'm glad to hear the sheriff took action, Lillian said, standing still as Lucy worked. He did, though I don't think it would have happened without Mr. Xavier, Lucy confided. My pa says Mr. Xavier went straight to Sheriff Davies first thing yesterday morning and wouldn't leave until the sheriff promised to address the situation. Warmth spread through Lillian's chest at this news. It seemed Yates had taken the incident more seriously than he'd let on. Mr. Xavier is a good man, Lucy continued, a knowing smile playing at her lips. Half the girls in town have set their caps for him, but he never pays them any mind. Yet here he is, calling on our new schoolteacher. Lillian felt her cheeks warm. It's merely a friendly visit, she demurred, though even to her own ears, the protest sounded weak. Miss Thornton, who was arranging fabric nearby, chuckled softly. Of course, Miss Newbury. Though I've lived in Bismarck for 2 years and never known Mr. Xavier to call on any lady, friendly or otherwise. The blue dress was finished and delivered to the boarding house that evening, and Lillian hung it carefully in her small wardrobe, running her fingers over the fine fabric. It was more expensive than she'd intended to spend, but Miss Thornton had helped her negotiate a fair price, and the dress was undeniably flattering. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Lillian attended the small church near the center of town, where she was formally introduced to the congregation by Reverend Thompson. She noticed Yates sitting toward the back, his tall frame unmistakable even from a distance. He nodded politely when their eyes met, but made no attempt to approach her during the service. After church, Lillian returned to the boarding house to change into her new blue dress, her stomach fluttering with nervous anticipation. Mrs. Farley, who had been informed of Yates's impending visit, prepared coffee and her famous apple tarts in the parlor, assuring Lillian that she would make herself scarce once her guest arrived. Though I'll be in the kitchen if you need me, she added with a wink that made Lillian blush. Precisely at 2 o'clock, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Farley answered it, and Lillian heard the landlady's warm greeting and Yates's deep, respectful response. A moment later, Mrs. Farley ushered him into the parlor. Lillian rose from her seat, suddenly conscious of her racing heart. Yates stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking more polished than she'd seen him before. He wore a clean white shirt under a dark waistcoat, with pressed trousers and boots that had clearly been recently shined. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd trimmed his stubble to a close, neat beard that accentuated his strong jaw. "Miss Newbury," he said, his blue eyes taking in her appearance with evident appreciation. "Thank you for receiving me." "Mr. Xavier," she replied, gesturing to the chair opposite hers. "Please join me." Mrs. Farley bustled about, serving coffee and tarts before excusing herself with another not-so-subtle wink in Lillian's direction. Once they were alone, a brief, awkward silence fell between them. "You look lovely," Yates said finally, his voice soft. "That color suits you." "Thank you," Lillian replied, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. "You look very handsome yourself." He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. High praise coming from a Boston lady. The ice broken, they fell into easier conversation. Yates asked about her first week of teaching, listening with genuine interest as she described her students and the challenges of adapting the curriculum to meet their varied needs. In turn, he told her more about his work at the Carter Ranch, his expression animated as he described the upcoming cattle drive and his plans for expanding the ranch's operations. "Mr. Carter's given me considerable freedom to manage things my way," he explained. "He's more interested in his investments in the railroad these days, which suits me fine." "You enjoy the work," Lillian observed. It wasn't a question. Yates nodded. "I do. There's an honesty to it that I appreciate. At the end of the day, you can see what you've accomplished." "I feel the same way about teaching," Lillian admitted. "Watching a child grasp a new concept, there's nothing quite like it." Their conversation flowed easily from topic to topic: books they'd read, places they'd seen, their respective childhoods, though Yates was notably reticent about certain aspects of his past. Before Lillian realized it, almost 2 hours had passed. "Would you care to take a walk?" Yates suggested. "It's a beautiful afternoon, and I thought perhaps you might enjoy seeing a bit more of Bismarck." Lillian agreed readily, fetching her shawl while Yates informed Mrs. Farley of their plans. The landlady's approving smile followed them out the door. The afternoon was indeed beautiful, with the September sun casting a golden light over the town. Yates guided her along the more respectable streets, pointing out buildings of interest and introducing her to townspeople they encountered. Lillian was struck by the respect with which everyone greeted him, from the bank manager to the blacksmith's apprentice. "You're well regarded in Bismarck," she observed after they'd exchanged pleasantries with the elderly couple who owned the bakery. Yates shrugged modestly. "I try to treat people fairly. That counts for something out here." As they walked past the edge of town toward a small creek that Yates promised offered a pleasant view, Lillian gathered her courage to ask a question that had been on her mind. "May I ask you something personal, Yates?" He glanced at her, curiosity in his gaze. "Of course. You mentioned that Texas held too many memories after the war. I get the sense there's more to your story than just that." Yates was silent for a long moment, and Lillian worried she'd overstepped. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady if somber. "My family owned a small ranch outside of San Antonio. Nothing grand, but it was ours. My father, mother, younger sister, and me." He paused, his jaw tightening briefly. "During the war, my father was killed at Shiloh. I was 16, old enough to run the ranch with help from our neighbors, but young and foolish enough to think I needed to join up and finish what my father started." They reached the creek, where a fallen log provided a natural bench overlooking the water. Yates gestured for Lillian to sit, then joined her, keeping a respectful distance between them. "I left my mother and sister with neighbors and rode off to war, saw enough bloodshed in those few months to last a lifetime." His eyes grew distant with memory. "When I returned home after Appomattox, I found our ranch burned to the ground. Raiders, not Union soldiers, just opportunistic men taking advantage of the chaos, had come through. My mother and sister." He trailed off, and Lillian's heart ached for him. "You don't have to continue," she said softly. Yates shook his head. "It's been 10 years. The pain doesn't go away, but it changes, becomes something you can carry." He took a deep breath. "They killed my mother when she tried to protect our property. My sister, Mary, who was just 14, they took with them. I spent 3 years tracking them, following rumors and whispers across Texas and into Mexico. found most of the men who'd done it, dealt with them as they deserved. But Mary, he shook his head, never found her. Eventually had to accept that I likely never would. I'm so sorry, Lillian whispered, tears pricking at her eyes. She reached out impulsively, covering his hand with her own. Yates looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. After that, I couldn't stay in Texas. Too many ghosts. So I drifted north, worked ranches in Kansas, Nebraska, finally Dakota territory. Ended up here 2 years ago when Carter offered me the foreman job. A small, sad smile touched his lips. First place since Texas that started to feel like it could be home. Lillian squeezed his hand gently. Thank you for telling me. I know it couldn't have been easy. It's strange, he said, his voice softening. I haven't spoken of Mary or my mother in years, not to anyone, yet with you. It feels right somehow. The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. Impulsively, Lillian shared her own story, not just the sanitized version she'd told others, but the painful reality of watching her childhood home burn with her parents trapped inside, of the guilt she felt for having been at a friend's house that night, of the crushing loneliness that had followed as distant relatives provided obligatory but cold support. So you see, she concluded, I understand something of loss, though not the magnitude of yours. Loss is loss, Yates said gently. It's not a competition. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the creek's waters catch the late afternoon sunlight. Their hands remained joined, a simple connection that somehow felt profound. Finally, Yates spoke again. I should return you to Mrs. Farley's before she sends out a search party. Lillian smiled, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. Yes, I suppose we should head back. As they walked back toward town, their conversation turned to lighter topics. Yet Lillian felt that something fundamental had shifted between them. The sharing of their painful pasts had forged a connection deeper than mere attraction or shared interests. At the gate of the boarding house, Yates turned to face her. Thank you for this afternoon, Lillian. I've enjoyed your company more than I can say. As have I, she replied sincerely. He hesitated, then asked, would you allow me to call on you again, perhaps next Sunday? I'd like that very much, Lillian said, her heart lightening at the prospect. Good, Yates said, a smile warming his features. Until then. He took her hand, pressing a gentle kiss to the back of it that sent a shiver of delight up her arm. Good evening, Lillian. Good evening, Yates. As she watched him walk away, Lillian knew with sudden certainty that her decision to come to Bismarck, a decision born of grief and desperate hope for a new beginning, had led her to something, someone, she hadn't known she was seeking. Over the next several weeks, Lillian settled into a pleasant routine in Bismarck. Her days were filled with teaching, a profession that brought her more satisfaction than she'd anticipated. The children responded well to her methods, and even young James, who had initially been so resistant, began to show genuine interest in his studies once Lillian discovered his aptitude for mathematics and challenged him accordingly. Sundays became the highlight of Lillian's week, for that was when Yates would call on her. Sometimes they would walk along the creek or through the more scenic parts of town. Other times, when the weather turned cooler as October progressed, they would sit in Mrs. Farley's parlor, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Occasionally, Yates would bring her small gifts, a book of poetry he'd ordered from St. Louis, wildflowers he'd gathered on his ride into town, or once, a beautiful hair comb carved from buffalo bone by a Sioux craftsman he knew. Tongues wagged, of course. Bismarck was still a small town at heart, and the attention the handsome ranch foreman was paying to the new schoolteacher did not go unnoticed. But the gossip was largely good-natured. Yates was well respected, and Lillian had quickly earned the community's approval through her dedicated teaching and proper behavior. Harper's show remained in town longer than expected, drawing crowds from the surrounding farms and settlements. Lillian carefully avoided the tents set up at the edge of town, and thankfully, Reed and Sullivan seemed to have given up their pursuit of her and Lucy Miller. Sheriff Davies maintained a watchful presence whenever the show was performing, which perhaps explained the men's newfound restraint. One crisp Sunday in late October, Yates arrived at Mrs. Farley's boarding house with an unexpected proposal. "I thought we might ride out to the ranch today," he suggested. "If you're amenable. It's about an hour's journey, and I've arranged for a gentle mare for you. Mr. Carter's wife has invited us for dinner." Lillian was surprised but pleased. "I'd love to see the ranch," she said. "Though I should warn you, my riding skills are rudimentary at best." Yates smiled. "Daisy's the gentlest horse at the ranch. She'll take good care of you." After changing into her most practical dress and sturdiest boots, Lillian joined Yates outside, where he waited with two horses, his own chestnut stallion and a placid-looking bay mare that regarded Lillian with gentle brown eyes. "This is Daisy," Yates said, helping Lillian mount. His hands on her waist were strong and sure, lifting her effortlessly into the saddle. "She knows the way to the ranch better than I do, so you needn't worry about directing her." The ride out of town was pleasant, if somewhat challenging for Lillian, who hadn't been on horseback since childhood visits to her grandfather's country estate outside Boston. But as Yates had promised, Daisy was steady and undemanding, following his stallion without complaint. As they left Bismarck behind, the landscape opened up before them, rolling prairies dotted with copses of trees, the distant hills a hazy blue on the horizon. It was a stark, beautiful vista unlike anything Lillian had known in the East. "It's breathtaking," she said, taking in the expansive view. "So much space." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's what struck me when I first came north. The openness of it all makes a man feel small, but in a good way." After about an hour's ride, they crested a gentle rise and the Carter Ranch came into view below. It was larger than Lillian had expected, a sprawling main house built of sturdy logs, several outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and in the distance, herds of cattle grazing on the autumn grass. "It's impressive," Lillian said as they approached. "Larger than I imagined." "Carter's been expanding steadily," Yates explained. "He was one of the first to settle in these parts, claimed the best land for grazing. Now he's the largest cattle operation in the territory." They were greeted by a ranch hand who took their horses, and then by Mrs. Carter herself, a handsome woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and a warm smile. "Miss Newbury, how delightful to finally meet you. Yates has spoken of you so often, I feel as though we're already acquainted." She enveloped Lillian's hand in both of hers. "Please, come inside. You must be tired after your ride." The Carter home was surprisingly elegant inside, with polished wood floors, comfortable furniture that must have been transported at great expense from the East, and even a piano in the corner of the parlor. Mrs. Carter explained that her husband was away on business in St. Paul but would return the following week. "He'll be sorry to have missed you," she told Lillian. "He's eager to meet the woman who's captured our Yates's attention so thoroughly." Lillian glanced at Yates, who looked slightly uncomfortable at Mrs. Carter's forwardness, but didn't contradict her. After refreshments, Yates offered to show Lillian around the ranch. Mrs. Carter waved them off with a knowing smile, promising that dinner would be ready when they returned. The tour was fascinating. Yates showed her the barn with its fresh-smelling hay and carefully organized tack, the blacksmith's workshop where a burly man named Peterson was shoeing a horse, the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived, and finally, a small cabin set apart from the other buildings. "This is where I live," Yates said, a touch of pride in his voice as he opened the door for her. The cabin was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs, bookshelves lined with more volumes than Lillian had expected, and through a partially open door, she glimpsed a bedroom with a large bed covered in a colorful quilt. "It's lovely," Lillian said, genuinely impressed. "You've made it a real home." Yates smiled, pleased by her approval. "It suits me. Close enough to the main operations that I'm available if needed, but separate enough for privacy." He showed her a collection of photographs on the mantelpiece, an old tintype of a family that must have been his parents and sister, a more recent photograph of the Carter ranch hands, and to her surprise, a small portrait of herself that she recognized as having been taken by a traveling photographer who had visited Bismarck last month. She'd purchased copies for her students' parents but hadn't realized Yates had obtained one as well. "Mrs. Carter helped me acquire it," he explained, looking somewhat sheepish at her discovery. "I hope you don't mind." "Not at all," Lillian assured him, touched by the gesture. They rejoined Mrs. Carter for a delicious dinner, during which the older woman regaled Lillian with stories of the ranch's early days, and, to Yates's evident embarrassment, tales of his first weeks as foreman when he'd been determined to prove himself worthy of Carter's trust. "He worked from dawn until well past dusk," Mrs. Carter recalled fondly. "William, that's Mr. Carter, finally had to order him to rest before he collapsed from exhaustion." "I wasn't that bad," Yates protested mildly. "You absolutely were, dear boy, Mrs. Carter countered with affectionate firmness. "But it's that dedication that's made you indispensable to us." After dinner, they sat in the parlor, where Mrs. Carter persuaded Lillian to play the piano. Though out of practice, Lillian managed a credible rendition of a simple chop-in piece, followed by a few popular songs that Mrs. Carter joined in singing. Yates watched from an armchair, his expression a mix of admiration and something deeper that made Lillian's heart beat faster whenever their eyes met. As the afternoon waned toward evening, Yates suggested they should start back to town before darkness fell. Mrs. Carter insisted they take a basket of freshly baked goods for Mrs. Farley and extracted a promise from Lillian to visit again soon. The ride back to Bismarck was quieter, both of them content in each other's company without the need for constant conversation. As they neared town, Yates guided his horse closer to Daisy. "I hope you enjoyed the day," he said, his voice warm in the gathering dusk. "Very much," Lillian replied sincerely. "Mrs. Carter is wonderful and the ranch is impressive. I can see why you feel at home there." Yates nodded, seemingly pleased by her assessment. "Mrs. Carter has been like a mother to me these past 2 years. She and Mr. Carter, they've given me more than just employment. They've given me a place to belong." Something in his tone made Lillian glance at him curiously. "You sound almost surprised by that." "I suppose I am still, after my family. I didn't expect to find that feeling again." He met her gaze, his blue eyes earnest in the fading light. "Just as I didn't expect to find you, Lillian." The simple sincerity of his words warmed her more than any elaborate declaration could have. "I didn't expect to find you either, Yates." They reached the boarding house just as twilight deepened into dusk. Yates helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. He walked her to the door, the basket of Mrs. Carter's baked goods in one hand. "Thank you for today," Lillian said softly as they reached the porch. Yates set the basket down on the railing, then turned to face her fully. "Lillian," he began, his voice low and serious, "these past weeks, getting to know you, they've been the happiest I can remember in a very long time." Lillian's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. "They've been wonderful for me as well," she admitted. "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures," Yates continued, but I want you to know that my feelings for you are profound, more than I thought possible." Heart racing, Lillian took a small step closer to him. "Yates." Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he raised a hand to gently cup her cheek. "May I?" he whispered. In answer, Lillian tilted her face up to his. Their lips met in a kiss that began softly, almost reverently, before deepening into something more passionate. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while her hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself as the world seemed to tilt around her. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he confessed, a smile in his voice. "I'm glad you finally did," Lillian replied, her own voice barely above a whisper. The sound of the door opening behind them caused them to step apart quickly. Mrs. Farley stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of amusement and feigned disapproval. "It's getting dark, Miss Newbury," she said pointedly. "Perhaps it's time to say good night to Mr. Xavier." "Yes, Mrs. Farley," Lillian replied, feeling her cheeks warm. "Just a moment more, please." With a knowing hum, Mrs. Farley retreated inside, though she left the door conspicuously ajar. Yates chuckled softly. "I should go before I damage your reputation beyond repair." "Will I see you next Sunday?" Lillian asked, reluctant to end their time together. "Sooner than that, I hope," Yates replied. "I need to come into town on Wednesday for supplies. Perhaps you join me for supper at the hotel restaurant." "I'd love to," Lillian said, her heart light with happiness. With a final, brief kiss mindful of the open door, Yates bid her good night and returned to the horses. Lillian watched him ride away, her fingers unconsciously touching her lips where she could still feel the warmth of his kiss. Inside, Mrs. Farley was waiting, her eyes twinkling with barely suppressed delight. "Had a nice day, did we?" "Lovely," Lillian replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. "I thought it might be," Mrs. Farley said, accepting the basket of baked goods with approval. "That man looks at you like you've hung the moon and stars, Miss Newbury. Mark my words, we'll be hearing wedding bells before too long." Lillian demurred, unwilling to voice the hope that had taken root in her heart. But as she prepared for bed that night, she couldn't help but think that perhaps Mrs. Farley wasn't entirely wrong in her prediction. Wednesday couldn't come soon enough for Lillian. The days between Sunday and her planned dinner with Yates seemed to crawl by, despite being filled with her usual teaching duties. Her students noticed her distraction, particularly the older girls, who giggled behind their hands whenever Lillian caught herself daydreaming in the middle of a lesson. Miss Newbury's sweet on Mr. Xavier, she overheard 14-year-old Catherine Peterson whispering to her friend during the lunch break on Tuesday. "My ma says they'll be engaged before Christmas." Lillian pretended not to hear, but the girl's words sent a thrill through her nonetheless. Was it too soon to be thinking of engagement, of marriage? They'd known each other barely 2 months. Yet in that time, Yates had become central to her life in a way that seemed both surprising and inevitable. Wednesday afternoon finally arrived, and Lillian dismissed her students with perhaps a bit more haste than usual. She hurried back to the boarding house to change into her best dress, the blue one she'd worn for Yates's first Sunday visit, which she now thought of as his dress. Mrs. Farley helped her style her hair, twisting the dark locks into an elegant arrangement that was more sophisticated than Lillian's usual simple bun. "There," the landlady said with satisfaction, stepping back to admire her work. "You look beautiful, my dear." "Thank you," Lillian replied, studying her reflection in the small mirror above her bureau. The woman who looked back at her seemed different from the one who had arrived in Bismarck 2 months ago, more confident, happier, her eyes brighter with anticipation rather than shadowed by grief. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at the door. Lillian descended the stairs, her heart fluttering with anticipation. Mrs. Farley opened the door to reveal Yates, dressed in his best clothes, a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers in his hand. "Good evening, Mrs. Farley," he said politely before his gaze found Lillian on the stairs. His expression softened, a smile lighting his features. "Lillian, you look beautiful." "Thank you," she replied, accepting the flowers as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "These are lovely." "Not as lovely as you," he said softly, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The Bismarck Hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in town, with white tablecloths, polished silverware, and a small piano in the corner where a somewhat ragged-looking musician played soft melodies. Yates had reserved a table near the window, away from the other diners, affording them a measure of privacy. As they enjoyed their meal, surprisingly good steaks with potatoes and fresh vegetables from the hotel's garden, Lillian found herself studying Yates's face in the warm lamplight. The strong jaw, the expressive blue eyes, the small scar along his cheekbone that he'd told her came from a fall from a horse when he was 12. It was a face she'd come to know well over the past months, yet one she never tired of looking at. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked, catching her gaze. "That I'm very happy," Lillian admitted. "Happier than I expected to be when I came to Bismarck." Yates reached across the table to take her hand. "As am I." He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about the future, Lillian." A small thrill ran through her. "Have you?" "Yes." He ran his thumb over her knuckles, his expression turning serious. "I know it hasn't been long, but He was interrupted by a commotion near the entrance of the restaurant. Heads turned as raised voices broke through the murmur of polite dinner conversation. "I said I want to speak to her now." Lillian recognized the voice with a sinking feeling. "Raid." She turned to see him standing at the maitre d's podium, his face flushed with anger or alcohol, possibly both. Sullivan stood behind him, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, please lower your voice," the maitre d' was saying. "This is a respectable establishment." "I don't care." Reed pushed past the man, his gaze sweeping the dining room until it landed on Lillian. "There she is, the high and mighty schoolteacher." Yates was on his feet immediately, positioning himself between Lillian and the advancing Reed. "That's far enough, Reed," he said, his voice cold. "You're disrupting these people's dinner." Reed sneered. "Of course you're here too, Xavier, always around to protect your precious schoolteacher." He swayed slightly, confirming Lillian's suspicion that he'd been drinking. "Well, you both need to hear this." "We're not interested in anything you have to say," Yates replied evenly. "Leave now before I'm forced to remove you." Reed's face darkened. "You think you're so much better than the rest of us, don't you? Both of you, but you should know what your interference has cost." Sullivan stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on Reed's shoulder. "Jasper, let's go. This isn't the place." Reed shook him off. "Harper fired us," he spat. "Because we couldn't deliver what he wanted. Said we were drawing too much attention, especially after that business with the Miller girl." He jabbed a finger at Lillian. "That's your fault, both of you." "I'd say Harper made a wise decision," Yates replied calmly. "Now, I suggest you leave before Sheriff Davies is called." Two of the hotel staff were already moving toward them, their expressions determined. Reed glanced at them, then back at Yates and Lillian, his face twisted with resentment. "This isn't over," he warned, backing toward the door. "Harper's still in town for 3 more days. He doesn't like being disappointed." With that final threat, he allowed Sullivan to pull him toward the exit. The restaurant gradually returned to its previous atmosphere of quiet conversation, though many curious glances were still directed toward Lillian and Yates's table. "I'm sorry," Yates said as they retook their seats. "I shouldn't have brought you here." Should have known Reed might cause trouble. It's not your fault, Lillian assured him, though her hands trembled slightly. Do you think he meant what he said, about Harper being disappointed? Yates's expression was grim. I don't know, but I think we should be cautious until Harper's show leaves town. He reached across the table to take her hand again. I won't let anything happen to you, Lillian. The conviction in his voice was reassuring, but Lillian couldn't help feeling that their perfect evening had been irreparably tarnished by Reed's intrusion. They finished their meal in subdued conversation, both trying to recapture the mood from before, but not quite succeeding. As they walked back to the boarding house, Yates kept a protective arm around Lillian's waist, his gaze constantly scanning their surroundings. The streets were relatively quiet, with most respectable citizens already in their homes at this hour. Only the saloons showed signs of life, light and noise spilling from their doorways onto the darkened streets. What were you going to say? Lillian asked as they neared Mrs. Farley's gate. Before Reed interrupted, you mentioned thinking about the future. Yates sighed, stopping to face her. It doesn't seem right now, not after what happened. Please, Lillian urged. I'd like to hear it. He studied her face in the moonlight, then nodded. I was going to say that I've been thinking about our future, together. He took her hands in his. I know it hasn't been long, Lillian, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet sincerity, brought tears to Lillian's eyes. Oh, Yates, I love you too. His expression lightened, a smile breaking through the seriousness that had settled over him since Reed's appearance. I had planned to ask you formally on Sunday with a ring and a proper speech, but after tonight, I don't want to wait. He took a deep breath. Lillian Newbury, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Joy bubbled up within her, dispelling the lingering unease from their disrupted dinner. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you, Yates Xavier. His smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, capturing her lips in a kiss that expressed all the love and promise that words couldn't contain. Lillian melted into him, her arms winding around his neck, her heart so full she thought it might burst. When they finally parted, Yates pressed his forehead to hers. I had a whole speech prepared, he admitted with a soft laugh, about how you've brought light back into my life, how I want to build a future with you. You can still give me the speech on Sunday, Lillian suggested, smiling up at him. Along with the ring, he chuckled, pressing another quick kiss to her lips. I will, and we'll celebrate properly without interruptions. They reluctantly said their goodnights, with Yates promising to visit the schoolhouse the next day to ensure Lillian arrived safely. As she watched him walk away, Lillian felt a curious mixture of emotions, overwhelming joy at their engagement, lingering unease about Reed's threats, and a growing sense that her life in Bismarck had taken a turn she could never have anticipated when she'd first arrived. The next day passed in a dreamlike haze for Lillian. She taught her lessons as usual, but her mind frequently wandered to Yates and his proposal. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even Mrs. Farley, wanting to wait until Sunday when Yates would officially present her with a ring. But keeping such wonderful news to herself was proving difficult. Her students noticed her distraction, of course. Miss Newbury, you seem especially happy today, observed Emma Miller during the lunch break. Did something nice happen? Yes, Emma, something very nice, Lillian replied with a smile, but it's a secret for now. The little girl's eyes widened with delight at being partly confided in. I'm good at keeping secrets, Miss Newbury. True to his word, Yates appeared at the schoolhouse at 3 o'clock, just as Lillian was dismissing her students. The children giggled and whispered among themselves at the sight of the tall rancher waiting by the door, his hat in his hands. Good afternoon, Mr. Xavier, Lillian greeted him formally, mindful of the curious young ears around them. "Miss Newbury," he replied with equal formality, though his eyes were warm with unspoken affection. "I thought I might escort you home today." "That would be lovely, thank you." She turned to her lingering students. "Off you go now, children. Remember to complete your arithmetic exercises for tomorrow." As the last child scampered away, Yates stepped into the schoolhouse, closing the door behind him. Immediately, his formal demeanor melted away, replaced by the warm smile he reserved just for her. "Hello," he said softly, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "Hello," Lillian replied, her own smile blooming. "I missed you," Yates admitted, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I hardly slept last night, thinking about our future together." "I didn't sleep much either," Lillian confessed. "It all feels like a wonderful dream." They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, discussing preliminary plans for their future. Yates spoke of expanding his cabin at the ranch to make it more suitable for a family, while Lillian wondered whether she would continue teaching after they married. "I'd like to, at least for a while," she said. "I've come to love teaching these children." "Then you should," Yates said firmly. "The ranch isn't so far that you couldn't ride in each day. Or perhaps we could maintain rooms in town for during the school week." His easy acceptance of her wish to continue her career touched Lillian deeply. So many men would have expected her to give up teaching immediately upon marriage, focusing solely on being a wife and, eventually, a mother. At the boarding house gate, Yates kissed her goodbye, promising to see her in church on Sunday. "And afterward," he added with a meaningful smile, "I'll properly ask for your hand, with the ring and the speech I had planned." Lillian watched him go, her heart full of plans and possibilities for their future together. Friday passed uneventfully, as did Saturday morning. In the afternoon, Lillian decided to visit the general store to purchase some new hair ribbons for Sunday, wanting to look her best for Yates's formal proposal. The streets were busy with weekend shoppers, and she nodded politely to several parents of her students as she made her way to the store. As she was examining a display of ribbons, the bell above the door jingled, and a man entered whom Lillian had never seen before. He was tall and well-dressed in an expensively tailored suit, with a gold watch chain draped across his waistcoat and a silk cravat at his throat. His hair was silver at the temples, giving him a distinguished appearance, though something in his cold gray eyes made Lillian instinctively wary. The shopkeeper, Mr. Bennett, straightened immediately. "Mr. Harper," he said, confirming Lillian's sudden suspicion. "What can I do for you today?" "Just some tobacco for my pipe, Bennett," the man replied in a cultured voice that seemed at odds with his predatory gaze. As Mr. Bennett turned to retrieve the tobacco, Harper's eyes swept the store, landing on Lillian with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She turned away, focusing on the ribbons, but she could feel his gaze still upon her. A moment later he approached, standing too close for propriety. "Good afternoon, miss," he said smoothly. "Bartholomew Harper at your service." Lillian nodded stiffly. "Mr. Harper." "I don't believe we've been introduced, yet you seem familiar with my name," he observed, a calculated smile playing at his lips. "May I have the pleasure of knowing yours?" Every instinct warned Lillian not to engage with this man, but the manners instilled in her since childhood compelled her to respond politely. "Lillian Newbury, I'm the school teacher." Recognition flickered in Harper's eyes. "Ah, Miss Newbury. Yes, I've heard of you. My former associates mentioned your reluctance to consider a position with my company." "I'm quite satisfied with my current profession, Mr. Harper," Lillian replied coolly, selecting a blue ribbon that matched her dress and moving toward the counter. Harper followed. "A pity. You have the bearing and grace that would shine on stage, and the beauty, of course." His eyes raked over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I pay my performers very well, Miss Newbury. Far better than a schoolteacher's salary, I assure you. As I said, I'm not interested." Lillian placed the ribbon on the counter. "This, please, Mr. Bennet." "Come now," Harper persisted, his voice lowering. "Surely you can't intend to remain a schoolmarm forever. A woman like you deserves better than dusty books and noisy children. My show is traveling to San Francisco next month. Think of the opportunities, the excitement. I believe the lady said she's not interested," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Lillian turned to see Lucy Miller standing there, her chin lifted in defiance despite the slight trembling of her hands. The younger woman moved to Lillian's side, a show of solidarity that touched Lillian deeply. Harper's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing into a practiced smile. "Ah, Miss Miller, isn't it? Another potential talent who has been discouraged from exploring opportunities with my company." "We both have respectable positions, Mr. Harper," Lucy replied, her voice steadier than Lillian would have expected. "And neither of us is interested in the kind of opportunities your show offers women." A flash of anger crossed Harper's face before he controlled it. "I see Reed and Sullivan were correct about the provincial attitudes in this town." He turned to Mr. Bennet, who had been watching the exchange with evident discomfort. "My tobacco, Bennet." The shopkeeper quickly handed over the tobacco, accepting Harper's payment with a nod. Harper pocketed his purchase, then turned back to Lillian and Lucy. "Ladies," he said with a slight bow that somehow managed to seem mocking, "a pleasure. Perhaps you'll reconsider after you've had time to reflect on your limited prospects here in Bismarck." With that, he exited the store, the bell jangling harshly in his wake. Lillian released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, Lucy," she said sincerely. "That was very brave of you." Lucy shrugged, though her hands still trembled slightly. "After what you did for me, standing up to Reed and Sullivan. Well, I couldn't let you face Harper alone." They completed their purchases and left the store together, Lucy insisting on walking Lillian back to the boarding house. "Harper's show leaves on Monday," the younger woman said as they walked. "Once he's gone, Reed and Sullivan will likely move on as well. They've been drowning their sorrows at the Silver Dollar since they were fired." "I'll be glad when they're all gone," Lillian admitted. "Though I can't help feeling sorry for the women in Harper's show." Lucy nodded soberly. "My cousin worked for a similar show last year, the stories she told." She shuddered. "It's not a life any respectable woman would choose willingly." They parted at Mrs. Farley's gate with promises to see each other at church the next day. As Lillian entered the boarding house, she couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something about Harper's parting words had felt almost like a threat. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect late October day. Lillian dressed with special care in her blue dress, weaving the new ribbon into her dark hair. Today, Yates would officially ask for her hand, would place a ring on her finger, and they would announce their engagement to the community. The thought filled her with such happiness that she nearly forgot her unsettling encounter with Harper the day before. Nearly, but not quite. As she walked to church with Mrs. Farley and the other boarders, Lillian found herself scanning the street nervously, half expecting to see Harper or his former associates lurking nearby. But the only people visible were other churchgoers, nodding politely as they passed. The service was uplifting, with Reverend Thompson delivering a sermon on hope and new beginnings that seemed particularly appropriate given Lillian's circumstances. She sat with Mrs. Farley near the front, while Yates, as was his custom, sat toward the back. Though she didn't turn to look at him, Lillian was acutely aware of his presence. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the churchyard, Lillian finally caught sight of Yates making his way toward her. He looked particularly handsome in his Sunday best, his blue eyes bright with anticipation as they met hers across the crowd. But before he could reach her, Lillian felt a hand close around her upper arm. She turned, startled, to find Reed standing beside her, his expression grim. "Miss Newbury," he said, his voice low. "I need to speak with you now." "Mr. Reed, please let go of me," Lillian said firmly, trying to pull away without causing a scene in the churchyard. "I have nothing to say to you." His grip tightened. "It's about Harper. Is there a problem here?" Yates had reached them, his expression darkening as he took in Reed's hand on Lillian's arm. Reed glanced between them, then released Lillian with obvious reluctance. "I need to talk to Miss Newbury. It's important." "Anything you have to say to her can be said in my presence," Yates replied coldly. Reed hesitated, then nodded shortly. "Fine, but not here." He gestured toward a quieter corner of the churchyard, away from the milling congregants. Lillian exchanged a glance with Yates, who gave a slight nod. Together, they followed Reed to the indicated spot, Yates keeping a protective hand at the small of Lillian's back. Once they were relatively private, Reed turned to face them, his expression strangely urgent. "Harper's planning something bad. What are you talking about?" Yates demanded. "After you cost us our jobs," Reed said, a flash of resentment crossing his face. Harper was furious. He's not a man who takes disappointment well, and when he saw Miss Newbury in the general store yesterday. A chill ran down Lillian's spine. "How do you know about that?" "Sullivan and I were across the street, saw you go in, then Harper followed." Reed ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely troubled. "After he came out, he found us. Said he had a job for us, one last chance to prove ourselves useful before the show leaves town." "What kind of job?" Yates asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Reed looked at Lillian, his expression grim. "He wants us to take you to him. Tonight. Said if you wouldn't join his show willingly, perhaps you'd change your mind after spending some time in his private company." Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. Yates's arm came around her waist, steadying her. "And you're telling us this why?" Yates asked, suspicion evident in his tone. Reed shrugged uncomfortably. "Look, we may be rough around the edges, Sullivan and I, but we're not. We don't force women. We talk them up, show them the glamorous side of the show business. That's all. What Harper's suggesting now, it's different, wrong." He looked directly at Lillian. "I wanted to warn you, don't go out alone tonight. Harper's planning to leave town first thing tomorrow, and he wants to take you with him." Lillian felt sick. "Thank you for the warning," she managed. Reed nodded shortly. "Consider us even now. I don't owe you anything anymore." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the side of the church. "You believe him?" Lillian asked, turning to Yates, whose face had hardened into an expression she'd never seen before, cold fury barely contained. "Yes," he said simply. "It fits with what I've heard about Harper. And Reed has nothing to gain by warning us if it's not true." He tightened his arm around her waist. "I'm not letting you out of my sight until Harper's gone, Lillian." She nodded, grateful for his protective presence. "What should we do? Go to Sheriff Davies?" "Yes, though without proof, there's little he can do officially, but he should know what Harper's planning." Yates looked down at her, his expression softening. "This isn't how I pictured this day unfolding." Lillian managed a small smile. "Nor I, but we're together, and that's what matters." They found Sheriff Davies still at the church, discussing the sermon with Reverend Thompson. After drawing him aside, they relayed Reed's warning. The sheriff listened gravely, his weathered face thoughtful. "Can't arrest a man for something he might do," Davies said finally. "But I'll keep an eye on Harper and his people until they leave town." He looked at Lillian seriously. "Miss Newbury, I suggest you stay indoors this evening, and perhaps Mr. Xavier should remain close by just in case. I intend to, Yates assured him. With the sheriff's promise to increase patrols near the boarding house that night, Lillian and Yates made their way toward Mrs. Farley's. The joyful mood they'd anticipated for this day had been thoroughly dampened, replaced by a wary vigilance that left little room for celebration. At the boarding house gate, Yates turned to Lillian. "I should speak with Mrs. Farley, explain the situation so she can be alert." "Of course," Lillian agreed, "though I hate to worry her, Mrs." Farley took the news with surprising composure, her initial alarm quickly giving way to practical determination. "Well, he won't be taking one of my boarders without a fight," she declared, brandishing a rolling pin with alarming enthusiasm. "I keep this by my bed for just such emergencies, and I know how to use it." Despite the gravity of the situation, Lillian couldn't help smiling at the landlady's fierce protectiveness. "I'll stay nearby tonight," Yates told Mrs. Farley. "With your permission, perhaps on your porch or in the parlor." "The parlor sofa is yours, Mr. Xavier," Mrs. Farley agreed immediately, "and I'll keep the coffee pot ready." "With the immediate arrangements made, Mrs." Farley tactfully withdrew to the kitchen, leaving Lillian and Yates alone in the parlor. "I'm sorry about all this," Lillian said softly. "Our special day." Yates took her hands in his. "We still have this moment," he said, his eyes warm as they met hers, "and I still have something for you." Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. Lillian's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the afternoon light streaming through the parlor window. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Yates removed the ring from its box. "It was my mother's," he explained. "One of the few things I managed to recover after everything. I've carried it with me all these years, never imagining I'd find someone I wanted to give it to." He looked into her eyes, his own filled with emotion. "Lillian Newbury, I love you more than I thought it possible to love anyone. Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Lillian replied, tears of joy welling in her eyes despite the day's tensions. "1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as though made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms, capturing her lips in a kiss that conveyed all the love, longing, and promise of their future together. When they finally separated, Yates kept his arms around her. "Once Harper is gone and this is behind us, we'll celebrate properly," he promised. "I want the whole town to know how lucky I am to have won your heart." Lillian smiled up at him. "And I want everyone to know how proud I am to be your future wife." They spent the remainder of the afternoon together, discussing their plans for the future in low voices while Mrs. Farley busied herself in the kitchen, tactfully giving them privacy while remaining within earshot. As evening approached, Yates reluctantly mentioned that he should return to his horse, which he'd left at the livery stable. "I'll be back within the hour," he assured Lillian. "Lock the doors behind me and don't open them for anyone but me or Mrs. Farley." Lillian nodded, seeing him to the door. "Be careful," she urged. "Harper might decide you're as much of a problem as I am." "I can handle Harper and his kind," Yates replied with quiet confidence, "but I'll be careful for your sake." He pressed a quick kiss to her lips. "I love you." "I love you too," Lillian replied, watching as he descended the porch steps and strode purposefully down the street. True to his word, Yates returned less than an hour later, accompanied by Sheriff Davies. The lawman had decided to personally keep watch from across the street, he explained, with deputies positioned at either end of the block. "If Harper or his men try anything, they won't get far," Davies assured them. Mrs. Farley provided a hearty dinner, after which the sheriff departed for his vigil, promising to check in periodically throughout the night. The other boarders, who had been informed of the situation in general terms, retired to their rooms earlier than usual, leaving Lillian and Yates alone in the parlor with Mrs. Farley hovering nearby, ostensibly tidying up but clearly standing guard in her own way. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck 9, Mrs. Farley finally announced that she was retiring to her room. "I'll leave my door open," she informed them, "and remember I sleep lightly." With a meaningful glance at Yates, she added, "The sofa is made up for you, Mr. Xavier. I trust you'll be comfortable there." Once she had gone upstairs, Lillian and Yates sat together on the sofa, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm around her. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of settling timbers. "You should try to get some sleep," Yates suggested after a while. "It's been a long day." Lillian shook her head. "I doubt I could sleep even if I tried. Too much has happened." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then we'll keep each other company until morning." They talked quietly for a time, their conversation meandering from memories of their childhoods to dreams for their future together. Yates spoke of the improvements he planned for his cabin: a larger kitchen for Lillian, a proper study where she could prepare her lessons, perhaps an addition for children someday. Lillian described her vision for a small garden, similar to the one her mother had tended in Boston, with herbs and flowers mixed together in cheerful profusion. It was nearly midnight when a soft tap at the window startled them both. Yates was on his feet instantly, moving to peer cautiously through the curtain. Lillian saw his shoulders relax. "It's Sheriff Davies," he said, moving to open the front door. The sheriff stepped inside, removing his hat. "All quiet so far," he reported in a low voice. "But one of my deputies just returned from checking the area around Harper's tent. There's activity there, wagons being loaded, preparations being made." "They're leaving?" Lillian asked hopefully. Davies nodded. "Looks that way. Earlier than announced. My guess is Harper's decided to cut his losses rather than risk confrontation with the law." He looked at Yates. "Still, I'd feel better if you both remained vigilant until they're well away from Bismarck." "We will," Yates assured him. After the sheriff departed, promising to return at dawn with news of Harper's movements, Yates resumed his place beside Lillian on the sofa. "Try to rest," he urged, drawing her against his side. "I'll keep watch." Though she protested that she was too alert to sleep, Lillian found herself drifting off, lulled by the steady rhythm of Yates's heartbeat and the comforting weight of his arm around her shoulders. Her last conscious thought was of how right it felt to be beside him, how safe and cherished she felt in his embrace. She was awakened some time later by Yates gently shaking her shoulder. "Lillian," he whispered, "Sheriff Davies is back." Disoriented, Lillian blinked up at him, then at the sheriff, who stood in the parlor doorway. Pale light filtered through the curtains, suggesting dawn had arrived. "They're gone," Davies announced without preamble. "Pulled out about an hour ago, heading east. I had deputies watch until they were well away from town." He smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "You're safe, Miss Newbury. Harper won't be troubling you again." Relief washed over Lillian. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said sincerely, "for everything." Davies nodded, touching the brim of his hat. "Just doing my job, madam." With a knowing glance between her and Yates, he added, "And I believe congratulations might be in order. Mrs. Farley mentioned something about an engagement when she brought me coffee at dawn." Lillian blushed, while Yates's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Yes," Yates confirmed, a note of pride in his voice. "Miss Newbury has done me the honor of agreeing to become my wife." "Well, that's fine news indeed," Davies said warmly. "Bismarck will be gaining a fine couple." After the sheriff departed, Yates turned to Lillian, his expression lightening for the first time since Reed's warning. "It's over," he said, taking her hands in his. "Harper's gone and we can focus on our future." "Our future," Lillian echoed, savoring the words. "It sounds wonderful." Yates smiled, the expression transforming his face. "It does, doesn't it? And speaking of the future—" He glanced toward the kitchen, where they could hear Mrs. Farley beginning her morning routine. "I should speak with her about our plans. And then perhaps we could visit Reverend Thompson about setting a date for the wedding." Lillian's heart leapt at the prospect. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Mrs. Farley, when informed of their intentions, was delighted, insisting on preparing a special breakfast to celebrate both their engagement and Harper's departure. By mid-morning, word had spread throughout Bismarck about both events, with many townspeople stopping by the boarding house to offer congratulations and express relief that Harper's show had left without further incident. In the days that followed, Lillian and Yates settled into a new rhythm. He rode into town more frequently, often staying at the boarding house overnight, so they could spend evenings together planning their wedding and their life after. They decided on a December wedding, just before Christmas, which would allow time for Yates to complete the planned additions to his cabin and for Lillian to finish the school term. News of Harper's activities after leaving Bismarck reached them a week later, when Sheriff Davies stopped by the schoolhouse one afternoon. "Thought you'd want to know," he told Lillian and Yates, who had come to escort her home. "Harper's show ran into trouble in Jamestown. Some of his performers complained to the local law about mistreatment, and when the sheriff there investigated, he found evidence of other illegalities. Harper's been arrested and his show disbanded." "And Reed and Sullivan?" Lillian asked. "Gone their separate ways, from what I hear," Davies replied. "Reed was actually the one who provided evidence against Harper. Seems he had a change of heart about some things." As they walked home after the sheriff left, Lillian reflected on the strange turn of events. "I never would have expected Reed to be the one to bring Harper to justice," she mused. "People can surprise you," Yates said thoughtfully. "Sometimes for the worse, but sometimes for the better. Reed made poor choices, but in the end he did the right thing." The weeks leading up to their wedding passed in a blur of preparations and anticipation. Yates threw himself into expanding his cabin, adding a proper kitchen and a small study for Lillian, while she divided her time between teaching and working with Miss Thornton on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory satin with lace accents. Mrs. Carter insisted on hosting a small party at the ranch to celebrate their engagement, during which Mr. Carter, a gruff but kindly man in his 60s, took Yates aside to inform him that, as a wedding present, he was deeding over a small parcel of land adjacent to Yates's cabin. "Been meaning to do it for a while now," Carter explained when Yates tried to protest the generosity of the gift. "You've more than earned it with your hard work these past years. Besides, a man needs his own land to build on, especially when he's starting a family." The wedding day dawned cold but clear, with a fresh dusting of snow that transformed Bismarck into a winter wonderland. The small church was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, filled to capacity with townspeople who had come to witness the union of their schoolteacher and the respected ranch foreman. Lillian, waiting in a small antechamber with Mrs. Farley and Lucy Miller, who had agreed to be her attendant, felt a curious calm. There were no last-minute nerves, no doubts, only a deep certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, about to marry the man who had unexpectedly captured her heart in this frontier town, so far from her Boston home. When the church doors opened and she began her walk down the aisle, Lillian had eyes only for Yates, standing tall and handsome at the altar, his expression one of wonder and love as he watched her approach. In that moment, all the trials they had faced, Harper's threats, Reed's warnings, the uncertainty of building a life in this sometimes harsh territory seemed worth it for the joy of this day, this union. The ceremony was simple but moving, with Reverend Thompson speaking eloquently of love, commitment, and the building of a new life together. When Yates slipped a wedding band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hand steady and sure, Lillian felt tears of happiness well in her eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thompson declared with evident pleasure. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Yates's kiss was tender, reverent, a promise of all that was to come. The celebration afterward at the hotel was joyous, with music, dancing, and more food than Lillian had seen since leaving Boston. Everyone in town seemed to have contributed something to the feast: Mrs. Farley's famous apple tarts, Mrs. Miller's fried chicken, Mr. Bennett's wife's pickled vegetables, and a magnificent wedding cake from the bakery that elicited gasps of admiration when it was brought out. As the evening progressed, Lillian found herself drawn into conversation after conversation, accepting congratulations and well wishes from what seemed like the entire population of Bismarck. Through it all, Yates remained at her side, his hand often finding hers, his smile warming her more effectively than the roaring fire in the hotel's large hearth. "Are you happy, Mrs. Xavier?" he asked during a quiet moment, his voice low in her ear as they stood near the window, watching snowflakes drift past in the darkness outside. "Completely," Lillian replied, leaning into his embrace. "And you, Mr. Xavier?" "More than I ever thought possible," he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life ensuring your happiness." "As I will yours," she promised. They spent their wedding night at the Bismarck Hotel in the finest suite, a gift from Mr. and Mrs. Carter. The next morning they set out for the ranch, where their newly expanded cabin awaited, decorated for Christmas with evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and a small tree in the corner of the main room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Xavier," Yates said softly as he carried her over the threshold. Lillian looked around at the cozy interior, noting the feminine touches Mrs. Carter had clearly contributed: curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the large bed visible through the bedroom door, vases ready for the flowers she hoped to grow come spring. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "Our home." The adjustment to married life came naturally to them both. Lillian continued teaching, riding to and from town with Yates when the weather permitted, staying at rooms they maintained in Bismarck during particularly harsh weather. Their evenings were spent in comfortable companionship, reading together by the fire, Lillian grading papers while Yates reviewed the ranch accounts, planning for the future they were building together. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one. The prairie burst into bloom, with wildflowers carpeting the land around their cabin in a riot of colors. Lillian planted her garden, delighting in the feel of soil between her fingers as she tenderly set out the seeds and seedlings that would provide fresh vegetables and herbs for their table. And in May, as the school term was ending, she shared news with Yates that brought a joy to his face she would never forget. "A baby," he repeated, his voice hushed with wonder after she told him. "Are you certain, Doctor?" "Mills confirmed it yesterday," Lillian said, her own happiness bubbling up within her. "He believes the child will arrive in early December, just in time for Christmas." Yates gathered her in his arms, his touch gentle as though she were made of the finest porcelain. "A family," he whispered against her hair. "Our family." The months that followed were filled with preparations, Yates adding a small nursery adjoining their bedroom, Lillian sewing tiny garments with Lucy Miller's assistance. both of them discussing names late into the night as they lay together in their bed, Yates's hand resting protectively over Lillian's growing belly. Lillian had agreed to teach until November, with Lucy Miller trained to take over her duties for the remainder of the term and potentially beyond, depending on how quickly Lillian wished to return to teaching after the baby's arrival. On a crisp December morning, with snow once again blanketing the landscape around their cabin, Lillian went into labor. Yates rode for Dr. Mills and Mrs. Carter, then returned to his wife's side, his strong presence a comfort through the long hours that followed. Just after midnight, as December 14th, 1879, began, their son was born a robust, healthy boy with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that would eventually prove to be as blue as his father's. "He's perfect," Yates whispered, cradling the infant with a tenderness that brought tears to Lillian's eyes. Absolutely perfect. They named him Thomas William Xavier, after both their fathers, a bridge between the past they had lost and the future they were building together. As Lillian watched Yates with their son, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the grief-stricken young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in Bismarck just over a year ago, seeking only a new beginning, to this a wife, a mother, a woman who had found not just purpose but profound happiness in this frontier town. And it had all begun with a chance encounter outside a saloon, with two men trying to force her onto a stage and a cowboy who had pulled her back and said simply, "She's not going. What are you thinking about?" Yates asked, catching her reflective expression as he placed their sleeping son in the cradle beside their bed. "About how we met," Lillian replied with a smile. "About how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't been there that day." Yates returned to her side, taking her hand in his. "I think we were meant to find each other, Lillian. Whatever path we took to get here, this you, me, our son, this was always our destination." As he leaned down to kiss her, Lillian knew in her heart that he was right. Their story had begun with an act of protection, of courage, but it had grown into something far more profound, a love that had healed old wounds, bridged differences, and created a future neither of them could have imagined when they first met on that dusty Bismarck street. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their small homestead in pristine white, while inside, the Xavier family, Yates, Lillian, and little Thomas, were wrapped in the warmth of a love that had found its way to them against all odds in the wild Dakota frontier.